Great to have everyone here. We are so thankful that you took time off to be with us today. This is the next in a series of conversations we're having with how do we want our community to be developed and what is it going to look like. As all of you know, this is an effort by all of our cities, Fairview, Spring Hill, Thompson Station, Franklin, Brentwood, and Nolensville, to try to work together in a collaborative effort focusing on some common goals that we ultimately want to settle on for this coordination between our municipalities and counties. Earlier today at Franklin Damar, which is overseen by Mindy Tate, Ralph Schultz was there and he presented some numbers that I thought I would share with you this morning to show that the timing is right. We're doing it at the right time to try to collect our thoughts and as we develop our county. As all of you know, we've got 247,726 certified population now in Williamson County. Our average age is 39.8, and our median home values is almost $500,000. That's a medium price home. Our educational attainment age now for high school is right at graduation of 95.3%, which when you look at the United States as a whole, it's about 88%, so we're about 8 to 9% higher than what's going on in the state, and so that's to be thankful to Jason and David Snowden, and even to our state leaders and the past governors that we've had and the direction they have sent us on. What Ralph said this morning to me really resonated, and I thought I would share with this, that during the last 18 months of our pandemic we've had in our country, and particularly here in the Middle Tennessee area, the new way to communicate or work, 22% of the people feel like that they'll be working permanently now from home as opposed to having an office environment. Those are things we need to take into consideration. The most striking number he gave me this morning was that in the next 5 years, we're looking at a 5 and 10 and 20-year window. You'll hear our panelists discuss what they're doing in their counties, in their cities. But in the next 5 years in the Middle Tennessee area being defined as Nashville, Rutherford County, and Williamson County, expected job growth of 233,000 new jobs, and expected population growth of 200,000. Those are very large numbers for anyone to have to address and how to handle. To give you a little bit of a look in the rearview mirror and what really happened during the pandemic, according to the information that Ralph shared this morning, again, Nashville MSA, between the year of 2010 and 2020, we ranked 4th out of the 51 largest metropolitan areas in population growth. That's 1 million population or better. Think of that. 4th in the largest metropolitan areas. And the Middle Tennessee area, just in the pandemic growth from June 20 to July 21. So a window snapshot of 12 months, the metropolitan area that we're engaged in was the 8th largest in job growth for large areas. And there was a net gain of 70,000 new jobs. 70,000 new jobs in Middle Tennessee. So it's appropriate that we hit this topic, and I want to say thanks to my counterparts, my mayors, and all throughout the area, and all of you as elected officials, because as we go down the road, we have to make some serious decisions. This time, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Dale. Let you do the introductions. Thank you for traveling down, and thank you all for being here.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Mayor Anderson, and all the mayors of the cities and towns for the leadership in this effort. My name's Greg Dale. I'm with a planning consulting firm known as McBride Dale Clarion, and it's been my pleasure to have been involved in numerous projects in Williamson County and several other cities, and especially to have been asked to facilitate this process. So the purpose for being here, the purpose of this symposium, is to learn from others about how you and your communities can work together to manage the growth that we know is coming. And I want to emphasize the working together. The mayor used the word common goals. You're going to hear the phrase multi-jurisdiction a number of times today. And what's important to understand about this effort that the county and its communities are undertaking is that this is not about what's happening within those communities. All of your communities, whether you're from unincorporated county or from one of the cities and towns, all of your communities are planning for growth. The growth that's coming is no surprise to anybody, and understanding the need to plan for that growth is known to all. But what we're focusing here on is how the cities and towns and the county can work together to manage this growth. And one of the questions is why now? Why are we worried about that now? The mayor gave you some numbers. I just want you to understand what you're dealing with here. So you are just under 250,000 in population now. Probably by the end of this symposium, you'll have reached it, right? I mean, that's how fast you're growing. The forecasts for Williamson County alone are to more than double that population in the next 20 years. Now, forecasts, they're not predictions, they're not inevitable. They are forecasts that are made based upon certain trends. And actually, there's 3 or 4 different sources of forecasts from different institutions, but what they all have in common is that huge magnitude of growth. So 250 or so thousand people now, you're forecast to have another 300,000 people in the next 20 years. And that growth has impacts. Personally, I'm not one that thinks growth is a bad thing. I would rather live in a community that's such a great place that people want to live here, right? I'd rather not live in a community that nobody wants to come to. So the growth, and it brings prosperity, it brings opportunities, but that growth, if not properly managed, has certain impacts, depending on what happens with the future of transportation. Imagine twice as many cars on the road. Think about the pipes that have to be put in for sewer and water and the treatment facilities and fire stations and schools and all those sorts of things. We know those demands are coming. The key is to plan for and manage that growth. And I think what's important to understand is the way Williamson County and its cities and towns have done things in the past is not a bad thing. Everybody has been dealing with their growth and with their business within their communities. But with the magnitude of growth that you're now facing, that go-it-alone approach is no longer going to be adequate. You are going to need to coordinate to deal with issues that any jurisdiction alone, including the county, is not able to deal with in terms of managing that growth. The theme of this session is beyond boundaries. So we're going to talk about the importance of boundaries, and that is where those lines are on the map. But we're also going to try to talk about the importance of thinking beyond that, and we're going to try to get into some mechanics and nuts and bolts about how different communities have done that. And then ultimately, I think my charge to you is to think about the long-term aspects of managing this growth. So I'm going to introduce our guests here. First of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what Williamson County is currently doing, because we are in the middle of a growth planning process, and I want to update you on that. And then we're going to have short presentations, just 10-minute or so presentations by each of our guests, and we're going to try to spend most of the time in a panel discussion, and I'll be asking questions and prompting things, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So if you do have questions, feel free to do that. So let's go to our first speaker. Let me just kind of introduce everybody. Rob Merchant comes to us from Beaufort County. He's the planning director for Beaufort County, South Carolina. For those of you who know Beaufort County, it is in the South Carolina low country, about halfway between Charleston and Savannah. It's a beautiful place. If you've never visited there, you should do that. You'll hear that Beaufort County has its own unique topography and geography. Some places that you would have heard from that are in Beaufort County, if you don't know it, is Hilton Head in one part of the county. It's also home to a Marine Corps Air Base and Parris Island, which most people are familiar with. So Rob is going to be helping us understand a little bit longer range perspective, because as you'll hear, Beaufort County has engaged in a couple of regional plans that have now been in place for 10 years or so, and it's got some history to it, and you can kind of track what's happening. By the way, we're going to use the term region in a number of different ways here. Beaufort County thinks of it as kind of sub-regions of the county. You can think of it as all of Williamson County. Obviously, you know, region is a much larger area, and I'll talk about one of those here in just a second. Leanne King, and by the way, these biographies are all in the handout that you have in front of you. Leanne King comes to us from Chapel Hill, where she is the director of Clarion's office in Chapel Hill, which is a planning and zoning consulting firm. She has a wide range of national experience. She's going to be talking today particularly about Wake County and the experiences of Wake County in managing growth. Wake County is where the city of Raleigh is in North Carolina, another high growth community. The Wake County experience is going to be interesting because it's a little bit ahead of where you are, but not a lot ahead of where you are. So they're going through a lot of the same things that we'll be talking about kind of in real time. So you'll get to hear about some of that. And in particular, the mechanics of the growth boundaries is something that Leanne can help us understand. Bridget Massengill is the president and CEO of the Thrive Regional Partnership. Bridget heads up that organization, which started with planning for a 16-county region. So her perspective is going to be different. It's not going to be the nuts and bolts of growth boundaries. What we're going to ask Bridget to talk about is how multiple different entities can work together at a larger scale. And I hope that you will be inspired by some of the things that they've accomplished. They wouldn't even use the term multiple jurisdictions, because that effort is not only the political jurisdictions, the cities and the counties, but it also involves commitments by the corporate community and by the philanthropic nonprofit community. It's a holistic approach to looking at issues in that region. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Let me just kind of catch you up on where we are in the process, though. So some of you may be aware that Williamson County has a county-wide growth plan right now. It was put into place, and you're going to hear terms like urban growth boundaries, or UGBs. Those are the areas around the cities and towns that are designated as the future growth areas for those communities. In the county, there are things called planned growth areas, which are some of the smaller communities like Triune or Grasslands are in that planned growth area, and then rural areas. Those boundaries were developed in 2001. Now, since 2010, this community has grown 30+%. I don't know what the statistic is back to 2000. So obviously things have changed a lot. And if you pull up, yeah, thank you. That's the map of your current growth boundaries. So you can see Brentwood, Franklin, Thompson Station along the interstate corridor. You can see Nolensville in the northeast and Fairview in the northwest. It might be a little hard to see, but each one of those has two shades of color. So the lighter shade inside are the municipal boundaries, the actual city boundaries as they existed at that time. The darker color surrounding it are the areas that are designated as the growth areas, or the urban growth boundaries. And in many cases, your current municipal boundaries have changed because of annexation within those areas. So that's what that is. So what we're doing now, and I'll explain who we are here in just a second, are two things. One is to explore updating those boundaries to bring them up to date. And in each of your communities, that effort is ongoing. If you're not familiar with that, if you're not up to speed on what's happening within your particular community. Talk to your planning staff because they're all working on this. There are public meetings being held within the communities as part of that. The planning staff for each community is working on updating those boundaries with consideration of those growth forecasts and how much growth are we accommodating, and in particular, looking at the provision of public facilities. So hopefully you all have some basic understanding of the idea that new growth requires public infrastructure and facilities, that costs money, that new growth is bringing in money. So how can we align the needs of the growth with the ability to provide public facilities? So that process is ongoing. And then the second thing that we're looking at in that process is the beyond the boundaries part, and that is that putting the lines on the map is fine and it's important, but what we also need to address is how to make those work effectively. And anybody who's been involved in development outside of municipalities and understands the annexation and provision of public services process knows that can get very complicated in a hurry. So one of the things we need to figure out in this process is not just how to get those lines right, but how to make them effective in terms of how they're administered. And we anticipate that those would involve some sorts of agreement between the municipalities and the county, and between municipalities where they share common borders. And those could be in the form of intergovernmental agreements or other sorts of mechanisms to essentially get into the issue of how we make those boundaries work best. And we're going to explore that, particularly with the Wake County experience of how those mechanics can work. We hope, we think that once that process has gotten to a point where the advisory group, which I'll describe here in just a minute, and your communities think we are on the right track, there is then a formal process that can be initiated under state law to formally amend those boundaries. But we're not there yet. That process has not been initiated right now. It's all in an advisory capacity. So the folks that are involved in that is the advisory group, and I'll show you a list of those names here in just a minute, which is providing overall oversight of this. And then the planners group is a group that's really doing the rolling up their sleeves, working on those growth boundaries and working on that. We are working with that group. We've had multiple virtual calls, and again, if you want to catch up on what's happening in your community, make sure you talk to your planner about that. We're also working with what we're loosely calling a technical advisory group, and those are folks like the utilities that we've been working with, the public works departments in the communities, traffic planners and so forth that have been consulted, and then my role is the facilitator of that process. So that's the group, that's the advisory group. I won't read those names, I'll just let you look at that for a second and read that. You can see that all of the municipalities are represented, as is the Chamber of Commerce, the county schools, and several of the utility districts and soil conservation. So it's a pretty good group it's a very good group actually, that's serving in that oversight capacity, in an advisory capacity. Okay, so one final thing before I turn it over. I want you to just understand a little bit about what the mindset of that group is in this process. One of the first meetings we had with the advisory group, one of the requests that came out of that was, let's try to put together some guiding principles. Let's not just turn this into drawing lines on a map. Let's talk about kind of to what end, what we're trying to achieve with that process. And so this is just a summary of this is just the headings of those guiding principles. The coordinated growth planning is on the one hand very self-explanatory, but on the other hand it's a powerful statement. It's saying we are going to coordinate this growth through this process, and that's important that is understood. The mayor talked about the 20-year planning horizon. Some communities are looking at increments of that, like 10-year and 20-year, but this is a generational kind of a thought process. We're trying to think a generation into the future. The whole public facilities and fiscal sustainability, that's the whole cost of growth. You probably understand that new growth generates revenues, which is good, but it also generates service demands, which cost money. So obviously we want those to be aligned. If you have a situation where it costs more to provide services to growth than it's bringing in, you're going to be in a hole, you're going to be constantly behind the curve and trying to keep up. So that's an important part of it. The Town and Country Regional Forum, that's kind of a geeky planner's phrase, but what that's really saying is what it is not about. It is not about sprawling all over the county and in the county's comprehensive plan, there was clear consensus about wanting to preserve the integrity of rural areas distinct from urban and suburban areas. And again, it's easiest to understand that what we don't want to see is massive suburban sprawl all over the county. Natural resource protection is an important part of that. But I think the other thing, this respect local autonomy, is really important to understand. This is not a super comprehensive plan. This is not opening up Franklin or Brentwood or any of the communities saying, here's how you should plan within. This is really looking at a countywide level and trying to address coordination issues that none of the individual jurisdictions can do on their own. And in particular with the focus on the boundaries, on where they are and what happens on each side of those boundaries. So in the meantime, the communities have always and will always engage in their own local planning within their communities. And there's no intent here to interfere with that. There's no new set of county-wide rules that are going to apply to everybody. There's no interest in interfering with the ability of the communities to engage in their own local planning and building on that local planning. This is not starting with a blank slate. Every community has a plan. Many of those plans have been updated recently. This is about trying to bring some closer alignment, or as the mayor say, common goals out of this process, and then ultimately to be able to wrap this up into a series of intergovernmental agreements, whatever form those take, and we're not yet at that point. So that's a quick introduction to what we're doing. So what we're going to do now is have each of our speakers, and you can stay where you are and present from there. Each of our speakers is going to do an introduction to what their community is doing and try to talk about a little bit about lessons learned, and then those should only take about 10 minutes apiece, and then we'll have a panel discussion including your ability to answer questions. So we're going to start with Rob Merchant.
All right. Well, thank you, Greg, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to start with this slide just to kind of introduce you to Beaufort County. I think Greg kind of gave an overview. We're located on the coast of South Carolina, home of Hilton Head Island, Parris Island, a little different experience. But also, yeah, this slide, I think, helps illustrate that, each of us in our local communities, whether we're in the low country of South Carolina or, in Tennessee, we have a treasured natural and built environment, and that we really have a responsibility with regional planning, to have a shared vision. And this is what we're, working to preserve. And, everything from the marsh views to water quality. We have a shrimp boat there, but if our, too much development, too much runoff, then all of a sudden things that we take for granted are threatened. And so I like to use this as a slide to kind of, remind everyone why we're here. Beaufort County, we just, with the new census, we're at about 188,000 people. And as you could see from this growth rate here, we were pretty much a rural backwater county up until, really the 70s or 80s when Hilton Head Island began to take off. And I always think that we are still kind of in a mindset that we think of ourselves as a rural county, and I think maybe this is the case of a lot of counties that have grown at this rate. Beaufort County is also, we are divided, you could back up. We're divided geographically, as you can see from this map. We have the Broad River that separates what we call the north of the Broad and south of the Broad. And not only is it geographically separated, but the culture and the markets are different. South of the Broad is Hilton Head Islands, the town of Bluffton. We have, resort communities, a lot of retirement communities, and then people there, a lot of them commute to Savannah. Northern Beaufort County is a little more of a small town atmosphere, and the military bases play a big role in the economy there. This map also illustrates where our municipalities are, and I don't know if it's easy to read here, but we show also, especially in the southern part of the county with the town of Bluffton, 20 years ago it was 1 square mile, and then now it's 50 or 60 square miles. So we've had a great deal of annexation. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but our annexation dynamics in South Carolina are different than North Carolina or Tennessee, in that annexation is largely driven by the will of a property owner. And in the case of our county, has nothing to do with the extension of water and sewer. So in the case of Bluffton, they had a lot of large tracts that were owned by paper companies that were divesting about 20 years ago, and each of them saw an opportunity. They felt that they can get a better deal with the town than the county, and so they annexed land. And the town, at that time, they adopted a very broad plan unit development, and then also we have development agreements which basically lock in the density and the standards over a period of time. And so that dynamic kind of explains how we really need to cooperate in Beaufort County in order to have a shared land use vision and planning vision. I'm going to just briefly go over each of the plans because it's kind of the way we're divided geographically. The plans really focused on different things. The first plan we did was for southern Beaufort County, and as I had mentioned, we had just experienced or came to a reckoning that with all the growth that we've approved, a lot of it through these large-scale annexations, that we were going to grow quite a bit over the next 20 years. I think at that time we estimated it would be 80,000. And so we really need to get on top of, not necessarily was it as much of a planning exercise as it was in analysis of how much growth we approved and what that means in terms of future level of service for our regional road networks, schools. And it became centered around what is the cost of growth and can we pay for growth. And so some of the advantages of this effort was that it really, we had a clear message about what the problem was, that we needed to get on top of planning for growth. And that led to, in the past, and also another thing it's important to understand, at this point, we were not an MPO yet. And so we did not have a lot of means to, a lot of availability of federal funds for our road network. And so a lot of our planning for roads, we have to do through a capital project sales tax, which requires a countywide referendum. We had been unsuccessful up to this point, but the messaging from this plan and this planning effort, led to a successful referendum. In addition, we updated our impact fees. And I would say that both of these efforts would not have been possible had we not had this regional planning framework. One of the other things is that we agreed that large-scale projects that, we set some thresholds in terms of peak hour trips, size or number of dwelling units, that we would share these projects with our neighboring jurisdictions. And that allowed for, cooperation that didn't exist at that point with the municipalities. And as I had kind of mentioned, I think to Greg, is that it really works both ways. A lot of times, having that other jurisdictions weigh in kind of gives you an out to or gives you some strength to turn down a project that may not be appropriate. And so it's really worked well for the region. Another thing that I don't have on here, but our bond rating improved as a result of this. Because we had better plan for our roads and better plan for our future, through this effort, our bond rating improved. And that's these are all hidden benefits of cooperating and working together. The next slide, and I think I'd mentioned earlier, that's the three jurisdictions were Beaufort County, Hilton Head, and the town of Bluffton. Northern Beaufort County was a much different dynamic in that we still have a large amount of rural land left in Northern Beaufort County. And so there was really a lot at stake here. And we're beginning to see a lot of the dynamics in Southern Beaufort County were starting in Northern Beaufort County. There were some large-scale annexations that took place with the city of Beaufort and the town of Port Royal that were not in keeping with the county's future land use vision for the area. And so we really had an opportunity to work together at this point to start planning for the remaining parts of the county that were rural and identifying those areas that are appropriate to urbanize and those areas that are appropriate to remain rural. Greg can probably tell you that we began this effort in early 2006. And at that time, you could barely get these people in the same room together. I remember Greg had gone to a meeting with the city of Beaufort, and it was just, so much anger that there was very little, optimism for success in the project, and I think the same was with the county officials. But really, this was kind of working together and trying to identify what is the common benefit for us having a shared regional land use vision. I think what really happened is that the city of Beaufort and the town of Port Royal realized that, if we if we agree on future growth boundaries, then there's not going to be all this negative press and anger from the county every time there's an annexation. In addition, they saw the advantage that in the rural areas, if the county agreed we're not going to upzone in the rural areas to urban densities, they would not have competition in the outlying areas. And so we really use these kind of common interests to provide a framework for the county. The successes of this is that we established a growth boundary. That is not that's not a state requirement in South Carolina, but we established a boundary in which, urban densities would occur and also the limits of annexation. We retained 60% of northern Beaufort County as rural, which to date, we've been able to keep that promise as far as the county. And we also minimize this zoning shopping that occurs because of our annexation dynamics. I would also mention with both of these groups that our cooperative planning did not end with the adoption of the plan. Especially in northern Beaufort County, we established during the process a steering committee that oversaw the development of the plan. That steering committee became the implementation committee and still meets today. And we, anytime there's an issue of, regional concern, that issue comes up to our group. We've done a lot of cooperative planning around the military bases. We have a Rails to Trails project that we worked with this group. And so it's just been a real asset to the region. And I'll go to the next slide. This is what it looks like. This first slide shows the boundary. And as you can see, the limits of the current municipal boundaries, and then what is within those boundaries. The town of Yemassee in the northern part of the county, that's a bit of an anomaly. They're a small community, but we kind of are keeping our eyes on them and trying to work closely with them in the future. And then the other part of this is that we adopted a future land use map that, kind of a general future land use map that we would honor. One of the things I'll say with this is that when this plan was adopted, it was adopted with a resolution that committed that we would focus on the nuts and bolts of how we would operate within and without of these growth boundaries. And we had spent the next year developing an intergovernmental agreement. And I can get into more of those details, when we get into the question and answer period. It's a lot of information, but hopefully this gives you an overview of some of the regional planning efforts of Beaufort County.
Thank you, Rob. Leanne now is going to talk about the Wake County effort, which, as I said, is a much fresher, newly baked product, right?
Yes. So glad to be here. You've got a beautiful community. So excited to talk to you today. It just occurred to me as you were talking that at the start of the Plan Wake comprehensive land use planning process, we actually were looking at Beaufort County and what you all had done. So it's exciting for all these different communities to be learning from each other and kind of sharing the lessons learned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience preparing Plan Wake, the comprehensive land use plan for Wake County. That started in 2018. We thought we were going to end in early 2020, and guess what happened? So it took a little bit longer than we planned, but we did. That plan was adopted earlier this year. We'll go to the next slide. So I think, Wake County is kind of an interesting one to look at because of, you're probably very familiar with the Research Triangle Park and the 3 universities there. The park was established back in the late 50s, and that really spurred a lot of growth and has continued to spur a lot of growth over the decades. the kind of growth management planning process for Wake County really began in kind of the late 90s when they were starting to realize a lot of development pressures at that time. They developed a land use plan for the county. They also developed a growth management plan for the entirety of Wake County. It was a multi-jurisdictional effort. And I think one of the lessons learned in reflecting back through this more recent comprehensive planning process was that the vision was there and the kind of coordination and interest in working together was there. What the challenge was getting some of the right tools in place, and I'll kind of talk with you through that story. So part of what came out of that growth management planning process and some previous efforts where all of the 12 municipalities within Wake County actually worked together to establish annexation agreement boundaries. So every community had their area of growth within Wake County. You can see on this map here the kind of orange or brownish lines. Those are those urban services areas. Those are effectively where the annexation agreement boundaries are. The gray are the current municipal planning and zoning jurisdictions. In North Carolina, we have what's called extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is an important planning tool. That's included within those gray areas, and we can talk more about that if that's of interest. And then the blue areas are the non-urban areas. Those include the water supply watershed areas that have particular regulations that the state puts in place to regulate development within those reservoir areas. We also have in the kind of southwestern part of the county, Sharon Harris nuclear plant. So there's some important kind of protections in place around that plant. And really, the running joke was that the county was essentially trying to work itself out of the planning business over time, because the intention was that each of these 12 jurisdictions were going to build to the edges of their urban services area, and the county wouldn't have any land to manage other than the non-urban areas. In effect, that has not necessarily played out in that way. The county does not provide water and sewer utilities. They're not in the business of what they call suburban development. They really want that to be happening within the municipalities. But again, the right tools weren't in place to really encourage that to happen. So fast forward to 2018, we start this comp planning process. The county hit the million population mark, so a lot of growth over a long time. They were getting 63 new folks per day, and they were projected to get another 250,000 folks over the next decade. So they said, we really have to figure out our issue and how we're going to plan for this, continuous growth that we're getting, because we only have so much land left. And I think that's maybe where there's some lessons learned from then, because they had grown a lot more than maybe Williamson County. Next slide. So this map, and I apologize, it's probably a little bit hard to read from where you all are sitting, but this is a really critical map in the early stages of our planning process at kind of painting the picture of what the challenge was. So again, the idea was that each of these 12 municipalities was really going to kind of have control over planning and development within their urban services area. The challenge was that it was faster, easier, and cheaper to develop residential subdivisions within the county on well and septic. And so that's a lot of what was coming in. And if you see the orange kind of darkish brown dots throughout, particularly the eastern side of the county, those are county subdivisions. And they really started, over time, one individual subdivision maybe not a big deal, but over time, the cumulative impacts of all of those county subdivisions really started making it very difficult for the municipalities to kind of plan for their future. A couple of bullets here in terms of the challenges. So, they weren't getting cohesive development patterns. There were lots of instances where there was a municipal subdivision right beside a county subdivision, and they looked completely different. One had sidewalks, one didn't. One had curb and gutter, one didn't. One was on well and septic, one was not. Just a completely different fabric. They weren't connected. And that really created a problem in terms of having a cohesive development pattern. The other thing that you can see is that it was really hard for the municipalities to provide utilities around those subdivisions that were in the county. They had to do some kind of crazy engineering work to make to make it around these neighborhoods. And then it also created difficulty in terms of providing public services within those fragmented jurisdictional boundaries. There are a lot of cooperative agreements in place, but ideally, you're not going to have that much fragmentation in terms of how you're providing services. And that goes for the county as well, because there were lots of places where the county had jurisdiction in certain areas that were really kind of in places that didn't make sense for them to be providing service. Next slide. So, this was a county planning effort, but really it was a multi-jurisdictional planning effort because the county wanted the municipalities to be taking on that growth, serving it, annexing as part of those communities. And this whole idea of plan together, track together, act together was very much kind of a central focus of this project, was how can we work together? We had the right vision before, but we weren't achieving it. So we need to figure out what we need to switch, what we need to change to be able to actually realize this vision with what remaining land we have left. Which was about, we did the numbers and kind of back of the envelope, it was about 40 years worth of growth was what was anticipated that they had left. So, not a lot of growth left in the grand scheme of things. So we took on a multi-jurisdictional planning process. We sat down with each of the municipalities, and we did, in some instances, site-level planning and kind of built from the bottom up in thinking about where our capital facilities plan, where are they serving today, and what do they plan to serve in the next 2 decades? What is your municipality's vision for growth within your urban services area? And what's really kind of an area outside of which you don't think you're really going to grow within the next 20 years and possibly not even beyond that? And so one of the things that kind of came out of this thinking is that the municipalities didn't really want their corporate limit boundaries to just mush up next to each other. They wanted to have some kind of natural, natural features dividing them. They wanted some rural areas to separate these communities so it wasn't just one big community at the end of the day. So those meetings to sit down early in the process and do that focused level planning really helped to develop the ultimate plan for Wake County. We also wanted to be maximizing some of the major transportation investments that were being made within the county, particularly the I-540 extension and some transit investments that were being made in the municipalities. And it really kind of created an opportunity to think creatively and collaboratively about how the county was going to do this. In North Carolina, we're fairly limited in terms of the tools that we have available to do land use planning. And so that kind of created this interesting challenge for us to think about how we're going to actually get this done. Go to the next slide. So this is kind of one of the key outcomes of this planning process is this development framework map. And if you'll note, similar to Williamson County, it doesn't have the municipalities grayed out. And that was one thing we wanted to embrace in this project is that we're looking at the entirety of the county. We're not planning for the detail of what happens within each municipal jurisdiction, but we need to think about how this pattern, how this puzzle fits together and how this pattern of development moves across the entire county. So if you can see the legend, the top 3 designations, transit-focused, walkable, center, and community. Those are what we kind of think of as the growth areas. Those are the places where we're wanting to encourage suburban scale development. Those are places that we want the municipalities to extend services to if they aren't there today, and ultimately annex within their jurisdictions so that they can have control over what those development patterns look like. And then the other 2 categories, we have one that's the lighter green as a transitional. Those are places that we did not anticipate infrastructure to be available in the next 20 years, but we knew that there were some growth pressures that would likely be occurring in those areas, and so they needed to have a little bit of a unique focus. And then the darker green areas, not just the water supply watersheds where you see the blue hatching, but some of the other parts of the county as well. The vision is that those are going to be rural and likely to be rural long term. Now, they can decide in future planning efforts if they want to change course on that and make those part of the community planning areas as well. But for this plan effort, that is the vision. And I was just going to go back real quick and note a couple of the key implementation tools. So I mentioned ETJ. During this planning process, and this should just give you kind of an insight as to what was happening and the concerns about the rapid growth, Fuquay-Varina, which is the southernmost city in the county, during the planning process actually requested expansion of their ETJ to include 22,000 additional acres. And it wasn't that the city wanted to necessarily grow into all those 22,000 acres, but they didn't really have faith that the county was going to control growth in the rural portions of that area. And so they wanted to get growth control over it. So that was kind of an interesting thing to be happening during this process. So there was a lesson learned there, and part of ETJ criteria is now tied to this development framework map, and the county said, let's make it easy for the municipalities to get ETJ in areas that we collectively want to be growing. If you want to have planning and zoning authority over it, let's give it to you, if it's in one of these growth areas. They also are setting out to do joint small area plans in kind of high growth, high pressure areas to make sure some of the development might still happen within the county because there are just limitations, and they know that. So they wanted to make sure that they were doing joint area planning so that there was kind of common interest and could create more of a cohesive development pattern. They're also ratcheting up their standards in a couple of ways. One is to actually have development standards that match those of the neighboring municipality in certain areas so that it's not cheaper, faster, easier to grow in the county. It was almost incentivizing growth in the county. And so ratcheting those standards make a difference. The other is this idea of the municipal transition standards, and that really is this kind of interesting framework. I think this is one of the pieces we might spend a little bit more time talking about, but essentially trying to sit down if a developer came into the county and wanted to develop a subdivision, the county would serve as the convener, would bring in the neighboring municipal jurisdiction and the developer and say, how can we make this make this a municipal development? And they would evaluate what the current plans and zoning were in place. They would look at infrastructure, what it would cost to extend municipal lines, and what it would cost to actually serve within the county, because there is a cost to serve if a development happens within the county. And opening up this door to the idea that the county might actually be a funding partner in some situations to extend services to a municipally developed project. You won't find those words in the plan. We didn't quite get over that hurdle, but I think it opens the door to that discussion and thinking about how best to be kind of managing and positioning this growth. And then the final thing here is performance metrics. We don't think we got it 100%. We think we're going to have to kind of tweak this over time, and part of that is annual tracking and looking at how well the county's doing in meeting those goals.
Great, thank you, Leanne. There's a lot there. We're going to come back to this slide, I think, and get into a little bit more detail because a lot of this is directly relevant to what you're dealing with in terms of the mechanics. But we want to turn to a different kind of project, and that is the Thrive Regional Partnership that Bridget's going to talk about. So this is the dream big part of our discussion here today, right? The mechanics of boundaries and drawing the lines on the map and figuring out the rules for all that kind of stuff is great, but there are a lot of other benefits that can come from different jurisdictions working together, and Bridget's going to share some of that with us.
Thank you, Greg. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, so thanks for having me here today. And I'll just point out on this photograph here, it's actually kind of telling about why we are doing what we're doing in the Chattanooga region. This may not be what you think of when you think of the Chattanooga region, right? Chattanooga is so known for the Renaissance that happened in downtown, but it's also known as the outdoor city. But it isn't Chattanooga when you look at this photograph. This is actually looking over at Marion County, standing on Snoopers Rock, on Prentice Cooper State Park, if you've ever been there. But it's an iconic outdoor kind of perception, and rightfully so, of the region that we call home. So our organization, Thrive Regional Partnership, has been in place since 2016. And it is an independent 501c3 that is there to inspire responsible growth through conversation, connection, and collaboration. So, why? Who are we? What are we here for? So we started by a regional planning effort. And in our case, when we talk about the Chattanooga region, here's what we're talking about. I have grown up in Hamilton County and always known that we had state lines that were literally standing in one city and in another city, but you don't even realize it, that you're suddenly now into the state of Georgia. And so when you're looking at this map, for our region, you are seeing 16 counties, you're seeing 3 states, color-coded to make it simple, and then you're also seeing 79 municipalities. And what we don't have listed on here is that there are also 3 metropolitan planning organizations. And so when you are looking at those interstate corridors that all come through and bottleneck right there around the Ridge Cut in Chattanooga, it's coming from 3, the planning of it is coming from 3 different metropolitan planning organizations. So there's one in Cleveland, Tennessee, Cleveland's metropolitan area, Chattanooga's metropolitan area, and then also Dalton, Georgia. So that's Whitfield County and the Dalton, Georgia region, but they all abut and touch on each other. And as this map indicates, when people ask, and they often ask, why did you set that geography? Because this is also telling of the commuting patterns. You know, people move into your community and they don't think about which county the job is. They just think about how they're going to get there, and they're assuming that the public sector is stepping in and planning in that way as well. No, not at all. And so when you look at the commuter pattern here, that's one piece. The second is the little note there underneath the 79 municipalities, and that's the 2 watersheds. And so the Tennessee River and the geography of our region, very telling why we don't have, in our case, an 840. We have too much mountains, rivers. The geography of our region means that there is no bypass around that region. To give you a perspective, it's 1 million people within that mega kind of, I'll call it mega region only this one time, as you're looking at this, but 1 million people that are all commuting, working, going to school, and playing together across this entire region. So we looked at the population growth, and Thrive 2055, we took a look at where was it. So in the 90s, it was around 864,000 across those 16 counties. And then are projected that by 2055, that it's going to grow to 1.4 million people. And so when we kind of thought about the population piece, it was, again, we're not working together as a region. We're not planning together as a region. Are we just going to let this population growth and all of the growth kind of management issues that come with it happen organically? Or are we going to actually get ahead of it and work together? And add on to that the complexity of not having one jurisdiction that can kind of manage this, because you're also seeing across these numbers and this region, the entire region is not in those 3 MPOs. It's not in those 3 metropolitan areas. So we also have a multitude of rural planning efforts as well that are not a part of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, but again, make up what our region is. And so I'm just going to tell quickly about some of the ongoing efforts that came out of this process. Some of these ongoing efforts include, freight was a big one for our region. We looked at the data that was making up some of our issues around transportation, for example, and found that 80% of the freight traffic that was coming through the Chattanooga region was not starting or stopping, but was just passing through. And when you think about how the Chattanooga Metropolitan Organization was looking at it, they were looking at it in their own individual, understandably so, silo. And they were addressing this freight traffic movement that was coming through. And then Cleveland's kind of getting a ripple effect. Dalton sees it coming through, but they're addressing it in that way. So if you can imagine, if the solution is simply to say, okay, we've got more trucks on the road, so let's expand. Well, are you really trying to look at what's driving that and what is the reason? Because not only was it 80% of the freight through traffic, but it was also in the top 10 metropolitan areas in the country for the number of freight volume coming through the region. So one thing that we did, and when you think about that map that I just showed you, for the first time, which is crazy to think of now, we convened TDOT, ALDOT, and GDOT to the same table to talk about the freight movement that was coming through this region. They don't have any reason to get together. That's what we kind of provide, is that platform. In addition, our metropolitan planning organizations don't have any reason to get together because they are kind of, in their minds, competing against Chattanooga and Cleveland, or competing against what TDOT's going to pick up as their projects out of their long-range transportation plans, for example. But guess what? We're not really moving the ball forward. We're almost creating problems for the next jurisdiction by not communicating. And so we provided the communication platform. And a big part of that piece where you see the Freight Mobility Coalition is the fact, and this is so important, that we had industry at the table. We had industry leading the table alongside of these public entities also coming to the table and sitting around and talking about the challenges that they were up against and looking at things and looking at data. I can go into way much more detail about that, so I won't right now, unless Greg wants me to. The next one I'm going to point out is the Cradle of Southern Appalachia Conservation Blueprint. So what's so interesting is, tri-state, 16 county, I talked about the geography. Well, you know that, first of all, Sea Rock City is not in Tennessee. It's actually in Georgia. It isn't really Chattanooga, it's Georgia. Cloudland Canyon, the Ocoee River. So when we went around in the initial part of our planning initiative, we asked people. So this is an important part to kind of take away, is that it was the people, the residents, the people that lived there that we got our data and input from. We actually spent a year going through a listen and learn session. But we asked them what they loved most about their home community. And they would often say, oh, I love going, kayaking down the Ocoee River. But they may live over in South Pittsburgh, Tennessee. They don't live up in Polk County, Tennessee. So beginning to build that regional identity, we were able to finally convene and get conservation partners from across the tri-state to put together a blueprint that said, what are the most significant areas? We know that we cannot save everything, and that's from the conservation standpoint. So what are the things that matter most? And getting them was not easy. Progress moves at the speed of trust. Trust is built by bringing people to the table and listening and learning from them and then moving together. And by the time, I think this literally took us about 8 years to get to this point, that conservation blueprint has now attracted $5.4 million from outside national funding to come in and help advance that conservation plan, because we have an entire region that is speaking from one voice around conservation priorities. We also take that to our economic development partners as well. They are aware. We keep everybody to the same table. Quickly thriving communities. We often show in some of our slide decks, we have this photograph of Atlanta. And, it is, as we've used the word already, the Atlanta sprawl. And I will say it is not actually Atlanta that you're looking at. You're looking at a bunch of communities that got swallowed up by growth, and they lost their identity in the mix. And so, again, after hearing from the people of the region about what they wanted to see from a growth perspective, this is our initiative around thriving communities, where we go in and we help communities identify what makes them distinct and then leverage that so that they can create economic development strategies that are truly about their local assets and the things that make them unique and how they leverage them. And then lastly, that connects with, this is the Natural Treasures Alliance, and then broadband, just another ongoing effort. So Thrive 2055, when you see this next kind of thing, this was a 3-year planning initiative, and it was inaugural. So I came on board right in the beginning, and we could literally spend the entire day talking about that walking into different county mayors' offices that had never worked together before and trying to say, we've got to start working together. The purpose, and this was the driving purpose, was to proactively engage the people of the region in creating an action plan that would make the most of our economic opportunities while preserving what we love about our home communities, plural. I do not know why there is a question mark there, but when I actually spotted that when it was too late, I thought, okay, so that's a challenge statement to you all. How might we engage the people of our region here in Williamson County in creating an action plan that makes the most of our economic opportunities while preserving what we love about our home communities? And that's where you listen to the people of your region to understand what that might mean for them. Those are some of the focus areas that we focused on. And then when I really kind of summarized, the Greater Chattanooga Economic Partnership has come out of this. That is when our 16 counties now have, it is where the economic development work now resides. I still remember everybody sitting across the table looking at each other like, why are you here? You are my biggest competitor. And then also hearing those same economic developers say, we tell a prospect that we can move any mountain, and thinking, oh no, because what about our Natural Treasures Initiative? Now they get it. That's what's attracting that recruiting project is the mountain. So let's not move the mountain. That took a lot of time. And then of course the organization, we got to the end. Y'all, people are not just gonna come to the table on their own. You have to have an excuse. You have to have a reason, and you have to be in it for the long haul. So that's part of our organization. And then also that geospatial data was huge for our region. And there's more coming out of that even as we speak that is happening around the data, because our job as an organization is to help inform elected officials, public bodies, cities, counties, economic developers, help inform them about trends and things that are happening so that they can make better decisions based on the data that they have. And we spend that time cultivating and fostering that data so that we can provide it, so that we can make good decisions moving forward into the future. So I think that's it. I know there's a lot more to touch on, but I'll turn it back
That
over to
was
Greg.
the best recovery from a typographical error that I've seen. That was well done, wasn't it? That was quick. Okay, so thank you all. There's a lot to go into, and that's just a map that's also on the back of your program, so you can see where all these folks are from. So I've got a couple follow-up questions I'm going to ask for our speakers, but please be thinking about your questions. We have a couple people. Joe, somebody else has a microphone, and Mike. So if you want to kind of get your questions teed up and give them a heads up if you want, we're going to be doing it that way. We want you to have a mic so it can be recorded. So there's a lot there to go back and cover. I think what I'd like to do is go to Leanne first, because here's the issue that is important. So you can have growth boundaries, right? There's geographic areas outside of the municipalities, which are intended to be the areas where the municipalities grow into. That all sounds great. That all sounds logical, and it is. But here's what happens. What happens in the interim in those areas when someone wants to develop land in those areas, but for whatever circumstance, the municipality is not ready to annex the area, it's not ready to provide services to it, but the landowner is ready. You can't say, well, hang with us, for another 10 years and we'll work things out. So, but keeping in mind that it could certainly develop in unincorporated county, but at that point it's developing with county levels of service and at county's densities. And if you think about those areas as being a valuable resource, we really don't want those areas to be used up in a lower density rural way, because those are areas that are identified for that future growth. So the mechanics of that become important. So Leanne, you talked about a couple of ideas, and Mike, maybe we can go back to Leanne's last slide, just because there are a couple of things in there I want her to identify and talk about. One is the transitional standards that you talked about, and the other is this concept of extraterritorial planning, because there's a number of ways that we can craft things to address those kind of interim issues, and that's probably the real real critical nuts and bolts issue here other than getting the lines right on the map. So Leanne, can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with ETJ first, because that's kind of the higher level tool. So this is a tool, again, that's afforded in the state of North Carolina. Municipalities can request from their home county that they have extraterritorial jurisdiction over an area outside of their corporate limits. Our state statute sets some specific rules about having, areas be along the boundaries or within a certain distance, so that you can't just go, bring in any old portion of the county within your jurisdiction. But, and there is a discussion with the county about getting that authority to have extraterritorial jurisdiction. What it essentially means, and it's not a perfect tool. There are definitely some downsides to it, but what it allows a municipality is to essentially have a long-range planning area. So usually jurisdictions will have it for an area that they know they're going to be likely getting growth pressures within or serving in the future, that they're likely going to be annexing. A lot of communities in North Carolina have policies, particularly municipalities have policies that if a development wants municipal services, water and sewer, they're going to have to voluntarily annex. So North Carolina is somewhat similar to South Carolina, that we can't just go annex what we want into a municipality, but if you want our services, then you're going to have to voluntarily annex to get those. So the ETJ area provides the municipalities with some control, planning and zoning authority over those areas outside their corporate limits where they anticipate growth is going to be occurring over the next couple of decades. And so that's a really important planning tool. The downside that some people talk about is the property owners within that ETJ do not elect the officials that actually create the regulations that apply to their land. So there you can probably see that there's probably some downsides to that and some concerns about that. But the upside is that it does create for more consistent planning within those areas that are likely going to be developing anyway. On the transitional standards, so Wake County, and I don't know exactly when they first established their transitional urban development standards, the TUDs. When we started the Plan Wake process, TUDs was in place and had been for at least a decade or more. And essentially, it was a standard in their code that said, okay, if you're coming in to develop a property within Wake County's jurisdiction, but you're within, and I think it's 2,000 feet of a municipal utility line, particularly sewer, we're going to tell you to go talk to that municipality because you really need to be tapping onto their line and be developing as a municipal development and be annexed into their community. So the movement, that was kind of the tool that they used for a while. Some of the planners thought maybe we need to kind of broaden that distance and maybe look at kind of some areas beyond the 2,000 foot, but also this idea of serving as the convener and that the county brings in the municipality and the developer to talk about how can we kind of best support this project happening at its highest and best use, which is not going to be development within the county under the county's ordinance. And so again, it was already happening informally during our planning process. Planning staff were starting to do that and have those three-way conversations and bring folks to the table. This, through kind of formalizing it in the plan, now they have the support of leadership and everybody's kind of on the same page that this is something that we want to encourage. And again, it opens the door to thinking creatively about other solutions. I mentioned earlier about, potentially having the county help assist with funding certain projects if they felt like it was worthy enough to do so, to make sure that it was happening on municipal services and as part of a become part of a municipality.
Good. That's helpful. I want to stay on that theme because one of the things that we understand is coming from different states, you have different statutory schemes. None of this is going to be a one-to-one kind of a comparison. So there may be certain aspects of the concept of extraterritorial jurisdiction, which you can do in Tennessee, as I understand it, recognizing that none of it's going to be perfect. But the idea of essentially agreeing in those areas to think of them as transition areas and the kind of standards that apply is helpful. And along that line, Rob, I was kind of hoping you could elaborate on kind of the rules with a small r, the rules that are applying, and you had talked about the intergovernmental agreement. Just talk a little bit more about how that's playing out in Beaufort County.
Okay. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, this is with the Northern Beaufort County Regional Plan, is that adoption was really we crafted a resolution that outlined that we would address certain things through an intergovernmental agreement. The municipalities wanted to make sure that they wanted certainty that the county wasn't going to, upzone in the rural areas and compete with them, or, upzone even within the growth boundaries when the municipalities had contiguity. Well, part of it has to do with our annexation laws. Contiguity is a requirement. In Beaufort County, that's a little more of a nebulous concept because we also have line of sight. If you could see land across the water, then that's contiguous, and that's led to some interesting annexations. But we basically have outlined in the intergovernmental agreement, if a property is in the growth boundaries and it's contiguous to a municipality, the county will not increase the zoning of that property. So if they want to increase the zoning, they have to go to the municipality. That's the easiest. If a property is in the growth boundary but not contiguous, then we give the municipality, we kind of refer it to them and give them the opportunity to work with the intervening property owners who are not necessarily, they're not part of the development that wants to increase their zoning, but trying to work with them to see if they're interested in annexing it as well. And that's something we've done from time to time. And, most of the time it's led to, well, these property owners are not interested, but it gives the city an opportunity to explore that. Then it goes back to the county, and then we can, then entertain an upzoning of that property. But also with that upzoning, we're working cooperatively with the planners from the two, or, one of the two jurisdictions that, that would be upzoning the property. I'm trying to remember, there was something else.
Well,
It'll come back to me.
while
Yeah.
you're thinking about that,
Yeah.
go ahead and talk just a little bit what I think was kind of part of that suite of tools, which is the projects of regional significance. You mentioned that earlier. I just want to make sure folks understand that because I think that's a really important concept.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'll go back to what I just remembered.
Remember you were going to say?
Is that we also have a metro, the city of Beaufort and the town of Port Royal have their own shared planning commission. And so what we've done is that we've added 2 additional members to that for projects that are in the county, in the area that is within the growth boundaries, but not in a municipality. So that's another way that we kind of handle these upzonings that cannot be annexed. Projects of regional significance, this is a tool that we adopted primarily in the southern part of our county, but it allows whenever there's either an annexation, an upzoning in part of the county, or even a large-scale by-right development, it gives the planners in the other jurisdictions an opportunity to review and comment. And this is something that has worked pretty well over, I guess it's been in place for more than 10 years. As I had mentioned earlier, sometimes it gives us cover if we're, wanting to turn down a particularly, controversial, upzoning or zoning amendment. But it's something that, and then also recently, the dynamics have changed in the town of Bluffton. It seemed like 10 years ago when we were doing the regional plan, any annexation was a good annexation, where now they were looking for the county to kind of be the heavy in turning down some annexation. So it's interesting how that dynamic has worked over time as the political landscape has changed and the reaction to growth has changed.
Yeah, so the idea here might be that a development of a certain size, however you define that, dwelling units, acreage, traffic generation, that meets a certain threshold of being a large development, proximate to a boundary, however you define that boundary, quarter mile, whatever it is, that it's very simple. It's a mutual commenting process. So there's nothing official, so if the county comments on it, the municipality can consider that or not consider it. But what it does is it helps, you've all probably run into situations where a development is proposed near a boundary and the people on the other side of the boundary are going to be, or believe that they're going to be impacted by it and would like to have at least a say in it. And that's all it is. It's simple. It's just another form of communication.
Hey, Greg, I was going to just add a little bit to that. So in talking about this idea of the county being involved with potentially kind of being a funder for infrastructure projects, one of the areas in this idea of regional projects of regional significance, I think, kind of resonates with what the Wake County is thinking. You might have noticed on the map there are these purple walkable center areas that are really trying to leverage some of the new transportation infrastructure coming in, and I think that those are the places where they're likely going to be willing to consider being a partner in making those projects kind of, served and kind of meet their highest and best use and kind of opening up those opportunities. I don't think they necessarily want to go funding everywhere. They don't want to, and we didn't have enough time to kind of work through the criteria in this process, and frankly, I think they feel a little more comfortable having some control in the beginning when they start doing the first few projects and get some lessons learned. But I think that's the idea is, because the county benefits, when they get a kind of a major new development, whether it be employment-based or housing or whatever, there is a benefit to the county. And so kind of thinking about the dollars and cents of the county being involved financially and helping that to happen is important, especially in a situation where that municipality is not ready to be extending that line at that time.
And Leanne, while you have the floor, I want to turn back to Bridget here next. But before I do that, I was wondering if you could expand on one other thing that you mentioned, and that is this concept of metrics. Right? It sounds like a simple idea, but the idea is once we establish a goal or a plan, is how do we track progress towards or not towards that plan, and how do we create what planners call metrics? That is just some way of measuring over time the degree to which we have success or we're falling short in implementing certain plans. So maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, we spend a fair amount of time thinking through this. We live in a world where there's so much data and it's updated regularly, and you can kind of get out of hand with how much you're tracking and reporting on, to the point where it doesn't really tell a very coherent story. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the kind of handful or 10 or so critical metrics that are really going to communicate to leadership and to the community about whether or not this plan is really achieving what it set out to achieve. And so we had these three buckets. One was kind of a county-wide bucket. So Wake County is particularly interested in kind of reducing car trips and vehicle miles, because they know from the modeling that they can't build their way out of traffic, and so they've got to look at other modes of getting people around. Their network is going to fail in 20 years. That's just a fact. And so they need to kind of support development that's going to encourage localized trips to reduce those trips, and also using other methods of transportation. I guess one of the good things coming out of the pandemic is a lot more people, particularly in the tech industries, aren't going to be traveling to work. So that's going to, help with some of those transportation problems. So that was a big, reducing vehicle trips was a big factor. And then there are several, I'll just mention two. Another metric was looking at where development projects were actually being approved on an annual basis. So if they're getting a lot of development projects over the next year or two in the rural areas or in those transition areas, then I think they're going to say, this isn't really working. We need to do something more. We need to have stronger regulations or something, because this isn't tipping the scales the way that we wanted it to. And so it's really important to have that kind of tracking to make sure, you're kind of achieving what you need to over time, especially since they don't have a lot of land left. A lot of people, I think, wish they'd done this, 20, 30 years ago, and maybe had a little bit more tools in place when the last go-round. And so they've learned from that, and they want to make sure that if this isn't working correctly, we have time to kind of see that on an annual basis and make course corrections.
Great, thank you. I want to ask Bridget one thing here, but then I'd like to kind of open it up to questions that you might have. So be thinking about those, and we'll try to work those in. So Bridget and I have shared this story many times, and that is having to do with natural resource protection. And we had a meeting, one of the early meetings, where we tried to bring together all of the people involved in natural resource protection and conservation. I mean, it was a room full of Birkenstocks, right, for this meeting. I walked into this meeting as a consultant, used to being the outsider going in and meeting people, but I walked in the meeting, what I realized is they were all introducing themselves to each other, right? So this was a group of people with common interests and common geography that didn't really know each other. And I want Bridget to talk about that process because the cradle of Southern Appalachia is a phenomenal accomplishment that they went from zero to what you're going to hear Bridget talk about a little bit more within, 10 years, 7, 8 years, whatever it is. And it's a good inspiration, I think, for us.
Well, and it speaks so much to that long-term vision. When I first sat down with one of our philanthropic partners, he had all of these funders coming to, or not funders, he had all of these different organizations coming to him wanting to get their conservation project funded. And that's when he realized very early on, they don't know each other. And they do not know that there's this other effort over here. And I remember him giving me this list that said the Conservation Caucus. And he said, my dream is that we get these people together and that they get to know each other, because as a funder, it's going to make those funding decisions so much easier when you're not the one sitting there having to say, did you know that somebody over here is already working on this project? Could you work together? And so it was really interesting because they didn't know each other and they had never met. And there's so many organizations. So right now, our Natural Treasures Alliance has about 40 plus organizations that are now kind of signed on as an official alliance partner. There's no funding for that. There's just, or they don't provide, that they agree that they're going to work together, they're going to sit at the table together, and that they support the benchmarks that they help to formulate and create. And so our economic development partnership actually moved much faster than this, which was really surprising because obviously that's where the most competition comes in. Well, they created the Greater Chattanooga Economic Partnership in 2015, I think it was, quickly out of the gate, boom. The Natural Treasures Alliance took much longer because people are so passionate. So those Birkenstocks are so passionate about whatever part of the outdoors that they are committed to. So with that work, we worked with our IGT lab at UTC, and they, because, as you all have this ability, because they could leverage data that in the public sector you can leverage, they were able to get and have confidentiality type of agreements to get all of this information from Land Trust for Tennessee, the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust, all of these different organizations to kind of put their plans in one place and then really start to look at these metrics of what was considered a high priority conservation area. Was it a critical wildlife corridor? Were there endangered species? All of these things. Were there intact forest lands? All of these things that ended up kind of running through this metric that now made the map, which is not on here. It's really beautiful. You can go to our website and see it. Made all of these things pop. And if they were bright green, it meant it was not protected, but it was really high priority. And when you look at our region, you would be surprised. Only 13% of the land across that entire 16-county region is protected. So I spoke about Prentice Cooper earlier, the South Cumberland Plateau. There's so many places that you assume are protected, and they're not. They're not protected. So when you think about the legacy that you're going to leave behind, these are not places that are going to be high priority for economic development projects, but they may be for that next residential development. They may be for that next set of condos that now completely erode the bluff that you've always looked at and grown up looking at as a beautiful place. So working with that, the conservation blueprint was really a testament to them coming together. And again, y'all, there's no teeth for that. I mean, we're not a government organization. So we have no authority. But what we do have is the power of people buying into and being a part of shaping something that can attract funding from outside, that can attract people that live there to go, oh, I love this because that's a view that I've always enjoyed, or that's a hike I've always loved. I didn't realize that it was kind of at risk. So that's been a really major accomplishment, and we now have a dashboard, which is also found on our website, that is going to measure how that 13% increases. And it isn't about a struggle between economic development and conservation, because what it also has provided is the land that is not high priority conservation. So when there's a project that comes in, it's not going to get everybody's feathers all ruffled because it looks like it might take away from, well, no, because we can't save it all. Here's what we do want to protect. And then you work towards these other things so that we as an organization continue to say that these are not two binary things that cannot work together. Development and conservation can go hand in hand, and here's how. And I also really quickly wanted to address the transportation piece.
Yeah, go.
Can I just quickly do that?
You bet.
As a result of bringing together our TDOT, our GDOT, our ALDOT partners to the table, we were able to attract TDOT's attention when the Federal Highway Administration released this. They called it the National Economic Partnerships Opportunity. That was they were looking for innovative multi-jurisdictional coordination around the movement of freight, something like that. And they wanted to see who across the country was convening multiple jurisdictions to solve this issue. And they reached out to us and said, we looked across the state of Tennessee, and you all are primed and ready for this, because we had been kind of making them come to the table and say, we've got to work for our residents, we've got to work for our commuters, we've got to just talk about this. And so as a result, here's the gift that it did give to our MPOs. They did not have to put any dollars into that match. They did not have to come up with their own funding to do this study. In our region, truck parking is a major issue, and it's one that we continue to go out and have to educate people from all levels that you would think would understand the problem, and they don't, and it's okay. We have to work on that. But by doing that, we were able to secure federal dollars to fund all of that, and our local governments didn't have to fund any of that. And that's just an example of when the power of collaboration can attract outside, federal, national, philanthropic, those dollars based on creating one voice and working towards solving it. And my phone died. I found the quote. Okay, good, we've got it. In the report that came out of that, and by the way, TDOT came to us and said, we really need Thrive to help us reach. I mean, they can't just suddenly take on Georgia and Alabama as a part of their study area. So they needed an organization to help kind of be that resource. And so that's what we did, and Georgia and Alabama came to the table. But as a result, in the report that came out, there's a quote in there that says, through seeing how the Thrive Regional Partnership conducts partner engagement, TDOT has seen the importance of each organization getting out of their respective silos to work together to develop solutions. They're actually taking that study to Memphis now with what's happening there and using that to help mobilize some collaboration that hasn't occurred before as well. And it's simply because we brought people to the table.
That's good stuff, Bridget. The power of one voice, the power of collaboration. That's a good lesson. I want to open it up to audience questions here to start with. So we'll start here, and then who else? And then one up there. All right, we got a couple here. Over here also. Okay.
Thank you, Pam Kasky. I have two questions. One, maybe for the Williamson County officials. As most of you know, I'm pretty new to Williamson County. Are there any regional planning commissions who control the zoning, or at least recommend to the county the zoning in their UGB areas in Williamson County?
I think I can answer that. I'm going to look to Mike to make sure I get this right. There is not in Williamson County an overall regional planning commission. There is a county planning commission, and that actually has overall jurisdiction within the county, but then within the county you have the municipalities, the cities,
But
and towns.
no municipality has formed as a regional planning commission under the state regional planning commission law.
None of the municipal planning commissions have jurisdiction outside of their corporate limits.
So a solution for the EJT solution is for the municipalities to form regional council.
I mean, that's maybe. I mean, that's an idea.
That's a correlation of what they're doing in South Carolina in comparison to what could be done here. Different, but kind of the same.
Fair
Okay.
point. Yes.
Okay, the other question I have is a very Spring Hill specific question. Did any of you deal with municipalities who were split between your planning area and someplace else that was not part of your planning commission?
Spring Hill is on the south end of the county, and part of it goes into the county to the south. So it is split between two counties.
Yes.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, well, we have two like that. One is, I think I had mentioned earlier, Yemassee, which is in the northern part of our county. It's in an area that's very rural. They are a bit land hungry, and they just recently annexed two very large pieces of property, but they're both under conservation easements, so there's really no consequence to the, and they just don't have the growth dynamic now, but that's something that we're concerned about. But we also, in the southern part of our county, the city of Hardeeville is in Jasper County, and we've seen this movement of development, starting at Hilton Head Island, moving west into the town of Bluffton, and now Hardeeville's the new Bluffton. And they're primarily in Jasper County, but in South Carolina, you can annex over county boundaries, and that's become a real challenge. And that is we are in the process of adopting an update of our comprehensive plan, and that's one of the big recommendations is working. We're going to be hopefully soon working with Hardeeville on a growth boundary. They have a very good mayor who's very regionally conscious, so we're hoping that we can get some progress there. Yeah.
Okay. Who did I promise next? Right there.
Good morning, panel. Thank you for coming and imparting your wisdom and experiences. Mr. Merchant, this question is for you. During your presentation, you iterated minimized zoning shopping. What does that mean again?
Oh, well, it has to do with the dynamics of our annexation. It's primarily controlled by the property owner, and it's in South Carolina, it's not necessarily tied to municipal services. So if they believe they can get a better deal by annexing into the city than the county, then, and so what it's led to is before we had a shared vision, if the county had a future land use plan and designated an area to remain rural and that property annexed, that would kind of, throw a monkey wrench into the, our future land use vision. But also with the municipality, let me think this through. I had an inverse to that, and I'm trying to remember what it was. But that's primarily what the dynamic is. And then when the county, we were, especially when this dynamic really started, and it really started when the county adopted a comprehensive plan and took seriously its zoning and came up with rural zoning. That was really the impetus for kind of starting some of these large property owners into considering annexation. And so we had a county administrator 20 years ago who felt that he had to counter the counter offers that the municipalities were making. And so that means a race to the bottom. he wanted us to develop a PUD ordinance that would basically, if the city says we'll give you 10 units per acre, we would allow 15, and so that's primarily the zoning shopping dynamic. But it is kind of an enemy to regional planning.
Not what you want to see with good planning.
Yeah.
Right.
Hi, this question is for Bridget. The conservation dashboard seems really intriguing, and I wondered what kinds of tools that are in the toolbox available to help move that meter, so to speak.
That's a great question. And the biggest tool that we have right now is this new Cradle of Southern Appalachia Conservation Fund. So as a result of that dashboard and knowing where those priorities are, being able to provide collaborative funding source that is designed to actually implement is going to be huge. Because what's happened in the past is you do have 40 plus organizations that are doing this work, but for one, the tool itself, this is going to sound funny, is a tool, because now for them to report back, which has never happened before, we're now seeing how this vision is kind of moving and evolving together. And then secondly, for them to have some additional funding sources to provide to property owners that may be interested in putting their property in conservation, that is a game changer for the region. We also are working towards targeted outreach. So for areas that we really want to go in, let's just say we have an area. So obviously on that conservation dashboard is the streams and rivers that are listed on the 303D list. And so when we can identify through that tool that agriculture is one of the leading causes, then we can provide workshops bringing together those partners that are within that 40 plus kind of alliance that are targeting practices and funding, their own kind of funding tools to be able to educate in a very humble way. I don't know how to properly say that, because obviously the farmers have been doing this for decades, generations. But to be able to kind of come in and talk about different ways, and then to be able to provide the funding that they may have through all of these different funding opportunities, we actually are developing what's called a Farm Connect tool that sources all of those additional funding sources that already exist to help with things like putting up a fence line to keep your cattle out of the stream and whatnot. And so when we can create that Farm Connect tool as well, we go in and kind of let them know about the resources that are at their fingertips. So education, funding, those are two big pieces of helping to advance the blueprint. And then the third is just the collaboration of helping the partners. There's so much power. It's the peer pressure power. It's when you know that you're going to be coming to the table with your peers and you're going to be able to let them know about a huge project that's happened, and they're going to cheer you on, and everybody's going to know, okay, this is actually helping us achieve that goal. Then that is also a hugely impactful and should not be underspoken tool, is just the power of having those cheerleaders in your corner that you know you can go back to. And so then everybody's kind of posturing for, I can't wait to tell you about and listen how this is fitting in. And there's power in that. There's great
Bridget,
power.
what's the source of the funding, the fund? Is it multiple different sources?
So it's actually, it's managed through the Open Space Institute. So it's not Thrive funding. I mean, it's not in our wheelhouse at all. We partner with them on it. So Open Space Institute is the one. They have a local partner in the Southeast Tennessee area that kind of oversees it, but does cover the entire 16-county footprint. And I believe it was the Doris Duke Foundation was one of the big funders of that.
Okay.
Really helped to put a big chunk of that. And then they are continuing to raise funding from our local foundation. So the Lyndhurst Foundation has put a significant amount of funding. And then they just recently had a local donor, a philanthropic individual, who put $500,000 into it because he understood what this was about.
I say that because you all are probably aware of this. I mean, you can preserve open space, you can preserve resources, you can preserve cultural resources through a number of ways, as part of the regulatory development review process, as part of things like voluntary conservation easements, but ultimately the best tool to have is to have a dedicated funding source to supplement all of that. That's why I asked. Leanne, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to build off that. That was a great story. And in Wake County, before the planning process even started, they had approved, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years prior, they had several big bond initiatives, and they funded open space, affordable housing, and schools. And they had specific criteria. It was basically on a project-by-project basis for open space protection efforts. And they had criteria, but this planning effort really helped them because the county didn't really have a map that showed the areas that they wanted to maintain in kind of rural conservation status. And now they had that through the development framework that was developed, with all participating partners. And so now they're changing their criteria for that open space funding because every year they get more than they can pay for. There's a lot of different property owners that want to participate, and so they're now prioritizing based on where you kind of fit within the development framework. That's at least one of the major criteria that they're looking at.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Who was next?
Yes, okay. Well,
Oh, yeah, go ahead. I'm
Good.
sorry. Thank you. I didn't
Okay.
see you up there.
Leanne and Bridget, hey, guys, thanks very much. This has been very interesting. Leanne and Bridget, I bet you both can speak to this. I wrote a bunch of notes down here, and I'm going over them. And you talked about how you accomplish separating municipalities from county rural areas. A lot of development is happening in different states, what they call agro-development, combo of that. The county, someone mentioned about county was not going to control the growth in those areas, and you talked about the ETJ. What were their concerns, and how did they overcome those? What are some of the things? I went back here to the notes of Bridget, and you talked about very similar things of how do you accomplish communities that get how do you stop them from getting all swallowed up? You were talking about Atlanta losing their identity. Totally get that, because you look back 50 years ago to what it is today. It's incredibly changed. So these notes I'm looking at, you said exactly what is the worry here in Franklin that we lose. I hear this all the time. I'm one of the elected officials, so I hear this all the time, that we want to stop growth. Well, we know that's not healthy, but they want to tap down growth. They want to tap down the density because we're getting way too dense in Franklin, and we see that all of our development is becoming so dense. So there's so many different concerns, and then we're talking, about the UGB. So can either of you speak to how you incorporate or separate these municipalities and protect them, protect the rural areas, and protect the county from the encroachment? Counties, there's a lot of county subdivisions all over the place that are going out, way out, and developing 20, 30, 50 homes, and they're dotting the county area. And that worries me as well, because I'm not sure that that's real smart, but then they have to put in septics all over the place. So can either of you speak to those worries and those concerns, and how you mitigate that, how you don't allow the people the municipalities to lose their identity?
Do you want to take a shot?
I'll start because ours is, again, because we are not a government organization, we have no authority, we have no teeth. There's a term that we often use in a lot of different ways, but it is all about the coalition of the willing. And the coalition of the willing is casting that vision and helping our communities to understand the value of, you're talking about smart growth planning. You're talking about making sure that you develop from within. One of our critical growth scenarios that came out of the Thrive 2055 process that drives the Thriving Communities program I spoke of is a grow from within scenario. So we asked the region, We showed them 4 different growth scenarios through McBride Del Clarion's work with us. We showed them 4 different scenarios and were able to ask people, which one would you most prefer? Some of them showed growth happening along the I-75 corridor. Others of them kind of had more of these like different, but then one was like everybody growing from within and focusing on the main streets and focusing on the unique cultural assets of their communities. And I still remember having a conversation with a senior high school class over in Polk County, which is the Coe River area in Tennessee, and asking them, is their preference that they want jobs closer to them? Would they like to see some of those fields kind of develop into industry so they don't have to leave the county for work? Or would they rather see it stay like that and they would rather drive into Cleveland, for example, for work? Every single solitary hand in the room raised to the Cleveland option and said, please leave this like it is. So that served as data to help inform local decision makers when the people are saying this is what we want. And so our Grow From Within model is all about working with local communities to help them leverage their existing assets and those things that make them and only them unique, and making it into a platform of pride for that community. We've heard some of our communities in our region that have said this platform was able to help give us a voice that we didn't have before, because we knew we had things to be proud of in our community, but we didn't really know what those were, or we didn't know how to find our voice, and now we have that voice. So that's an entire different story as well. But it is about developing the community pride and saying we already have these assets, let's grow from within instead of spreading out. And then the second part of it is creating a sustained, creating a good outdoor stewardship environment that people don't want to see that land get developed, because they are now, it's a responsible land use ethic in essence that we are trying to encourage through the education parts that we do and getting people outside to explore. But I say that to say I would be remiss to also acknowledge that it's really sad when I see so much of our region getting developed into a sprawl way. It's still happening. We don't have the tools that planning commissions do. Maybe that's what you could talk about.
Yeah, so if we could go back to that development framework map, it's, I think it's the last slide that I had, so it might be a couple before this. So a couple of different things. I think, so I had the fortunate opportunity to work a few years back on the Cary community plan. So Cary, many of you may be familiar with Cary, North Carolina. And Cary's one of those areas that they essentially built out to their urban services area. They did not really have too much land left in that little orange boundary when we started doing that community plan. And so that was very much one of the concerns. Well, they had two concerns. One was losing community character. It's a beautiful town. In some ways, it's similar to Franklin. I think that they pride themselves on their quality of development there. They have a lot of kind of interesting things that they put their foot down about. For one example is they work with NCDOT. They say no more than 4 lanes anywhere in our town. We do not want a highway running through our community. So they do certain things that just, kind of put character first. When we worked on the Cary Community Plan, they didn't have a whole lot of land left. They spent a lot of time focusing on some of the critical rural and culturally historic areas that they wanted to be protecting. And I think that was a really important effort. They did some small area planning as part of the overall comprehensive planning process to really kind of get into the weeds. I joke about how that's the one and only comprehensive plan that I've ever worked on that had the term pea gravel in it. We got really down in the weeds in terms of some of the planning recommendations that we got into. But I think that's part of it is kind of identifying those places that you want to protect and planning for those and making sure you have the tools in place to protect, because the development pressures in that community are strong. And with Apple coming in now, you can only imagine what's going to be happening within the region over the next 2 decades in terms of development. The other thing I wanted to mention that was interesting, we did scenario planning during the plan wake process as well, and it was interesting because we were using the travel demand model for the regional MPO Campo, and we're looking at we started with old numbers that the different municipalities in the county had developed in terms of their growth projections that were probably like, I can't remember exactly, 5 to 7 years old, something to that effect. And when we went back and sat down with all those local governments, many of which had just completed planning efforts and looked at their own projections, there was this kind of change where they weren't really embracing growth before, and they were really starting to embrace that they were going to grow and change. And a lot of what was happening was we are no longer going to go with we call it the spread the peanut butter approach. If we're going to develop, we're just going to do low density sprawl out to the edges. And they're realizing, like, that's just not going to work. That's not going to maintain the character that we want for our communities. And so what they started doing is saying, okay, density's been a 4-letter word for a long time, but it's really about design. I mean, if you look at downtown Franklin, it's a beautiful place. It's kind of dense, you know? I mean, those are, large lot sizes. So we know how to do it. We've done it right before in the past. They just needed to get the right standards in place to make sure that the new development was coming on board, had parks and trails and open spaces as part of the developments, had, really attractive quality subdivision amenities and design. So I think that was part of it, is like, we can do this better, and we are going to we need this growth, Cary in particular, because they were realizing that a lot of their revenues in the past, a lot of the quality of life amenities that they fund, they have like a rec and park guide this thick, it's pretty amazing, was funded by new development. And they were realizing, if we want to continue on this train of having this high quality of life, we got to figure out where these fiscal resources are going to come from, because we're quickly approaching a build-out scenario. And so now they're in a redevelopment scenario and thinking about how can we kind of redevelop and be the next generation Cary, but still maintain the things, the historic Carpenter area and parts of Southwest Cary that are really kind of critical rural areas that they want to protect.
While we're moving the mic to the next speaker, I just want to do one follow-up to that question, because I hope that you all walk out of this feeling a little bit optimistic, because you're doing what you need to do to accomplish what you're saying. If you look at the county's recent comprehensive plan, it looks very similar to that. It's a similar kind of strategy. And these growth boundaries and getting those right and continuing to do the kinds of things that these communities do. You said Wake County probably wish they'd have done this 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. It is timely for you now. So you're in the right place at the right time. You just need to have the staying power to see it through. Question here next. And then Mike, we got one up there that'll, right in the middle.
Leanne, this question, so close, but yet so far. This question is for you about water districts. You mentioned you had some subdivisions that had wells, and they also had septic. Do you have many water districts throughout Wake County? Do they coordinate?
So luckily that is it's simplified within Wake County. I have seen other communities where it's less, more of a challenge with more kind of different jurisdictions that don't necessarily coordinate. In Wake County, the majority of, when we're talking about kind of provision of water and sewer, most of it comes through Raleigh Public Utilities. So they provide service not only to Raleigh, but there were individual systems on most of the eastern communities in the county, and they consolidated those, I don't know, sometime 10, 20 years ago. I'm not exactly sure when that happened. And so Raleigh Public Utilities has very consistent policies about where they will extend lines into. For example, the water supply watershed areas, this was, again, one of those growth management tools they established long ago, and I think they're happy they did. Those green areas do have development in them, but it's fairly low density development, because they said we do not want to be doing suburban scale development within these areas. We want to protect those reservoirs. The Little River is the one just kind of the furthest west. That's actually not an active reservoir yet, they got all this growth, and they know they're going to need that source water in the future, and so they're trying to do what they can to protect that area. from encroachment, from development. And there was actually a request by one of the communities up there to kind of nudge that line a little bit. They wanted to be able to grow a little bit into the watershed area. And there was a hard no from Raleigh Public Utilities that, no, we're not going to do that, because that's been our consistent policy for a long time. And unless you give us some good reason to do it, we're not going to allow for development within that area.
So there are areas that do still have wells.
Oh,
in
definitely.
Wake County.
Yeah, definitely. If you, that dot map that had the orange dots
Yeah,
across it,
yeah.
most of those are on well and septic. And I won't get into it, but they also have this very interesting well issue in the eastern parts. It's a geological formation challenge. But they might actually, I think one of the solutions they're looking at is potentially providing water service to some of those, communities, but it's really more of a health and safety issue more
Yeah.
than anything else.
And then there's septic. Is it strictly a traditional septic tank? Are there recirculating sand filters in play?
They have a-
in step systems?
They have a variety of
Yeah.
kind of approaches that they use for non-municipal wastewater treatment. So, the kind of the traditional one that they had for a long time was, individual septic systems
Yes.
within a lot. But then, I toured some projects where they actually had kind of a common area where there was essentially like a spray field for that subdivision.
Oh, yeah.
They have some projects are large enough that they've actually built kind of small package plants that are almost like municipal services, but it's just feeding, just supporting that one particular project. So that was one of the challenges, because you could engineer your way out of any situation. And so that was not a hurdle to development. And so, and I don't think the county necessarily wanted to regulate those tools and approaches, but what they wanted to do was make it easier and better to go on municipal services.
And Wake County has a lot of sandy soil, is that correct?
Parts of it. I mean, there is active agriculture, so they do have some prime soils there, but I think they're further south of there is the Sandhills area where you get really
Yes.
sandy
Oh, yeah.
soils,
Yeah.
Pinehurst and places like that.
Right.
But I think there probably is some sandy soil areas in Wake County.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may, Rob, your county, I always want to say Beaufort, so it's Beaufort County.
Beaufort, North Carolina, Beaufort, South Carolina.
Yeah.
No wonder. So, thank you. So, your county is fragmented. Do you have one water source? Do you have different water districts that work together cohesively?
Most of the county is served by the Beaufort Jasper Water Sewer Authority.
Yes.
And because we're on the coast,
Yes.
a lot of, there's been a lot of saltwater intrusion in the shallower wells. And so many years ago, they established that authority, and primarily the drinking water comes from the Savannah River,
Right.
far enough upstream. Hilton Head has some deep wells, and so they get some additional water. And then they buy water from the Beaufort Jasper Water Sewer Authority.
So, thank you very much. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question up here, and then we'll do some concluding remarks. We'll try to get you out of here by about 10 after at the latest.
Well, this is for all of you. We all live in a world where it's pretty much driven by property owner rights, whether it's an application or a referendum. That gets in the way of logical expansion, building on of infrastructure, those kind of things, the way we'd like to do it. How have you bridged that most effectively? What ideas do you have? We talked a little bit about some of this, but when you reflect on that, what tool do you have, or what tool do you wish you had that would help you do that more logically?
I can jump in. So we did some education as part of the Plan Wake process, particularly for rural property owners, many of which were very supportive of the general concept. But, in any high-growth county, the land is most people's 401k, and so they need to protect those interests. And, one of the things that we were showing them are examples of, well, getting them to think outside of their two options. I either keep my land as it is today, or I build a subdivision on it. And those are not the only two options available to rural property owners. And I think that was kind of an important part of the discussion. We looked at Loudoun County, Loudoun County, Virginia, Montgomery County, Maryland, places that have done kind of rural preservation for a long time. And if you look at the property values in those areas, I mean, they're very high quality rural lands. And, there's some variety of different types of developments, hobby farms and other things like that. So thinking about it in a different way, that there aren't just these kind of two traditional options for a rural property owner, I think was really important. And just embracing that we understand that this is something that's important to you, because I think behind the property rights ultimately is really kind of the kind of financial future, of these folks. That's really kind of what's underlying it. And so having a conversation about how can we make sure that you feel comfortable and that you have a strong financial future, and maybe protect the rural character of your community, of your property and your community. Most landowners wanted to do that. It wasn't that they just wanted to build a subdivision on their property. It was really about they're securing their finances. So,
Did we? All right. I had promised this gentleman. Did you have a final question? You got it. Okay. Okay. So unless there's another one final burning question, I think let's start to bring this to a close. I just want to make a couple of kind of comments here, because one of the things I think I take away from this is, while every system is different, every county within the state is different, certainly within statutory schemes, they're different. But from everything I know, everything that we're talking about here in terms of creating better predictability, staying ahead of growth in terms of providing public services and facilities, and doing that in a fiscally responsible manner, efficient boundaries, being able to have your cake and eat it too, right? That is, being able to accommodate the growth and the prosperity and also preserve what's important to you preserve. It is doable. It may not be exactly the way these other communities have done it, but it is doable. Where there is a will, there is a way, whether with existing tools or whether it's some sort of intergovernmental agreements, or even if it requires some statutory change. Williamson County is a big, robust county now. It can argue for those kinds of changes if it needs to. I think there's a way to do it. My recipe for you, for what it's worth, is you think about doing three things. You get the boundaries right. You're working on that now. That's in process as we speak. You update those 20-year-old boundaries. Number two, you put the rules into place to administer those boundaries efficiently and deal with things like annexation and the provision of services and all of those sorts of things. And then number three, you dream big. You take a cue from what the Chattanooga region has done, and that is, there are other regional issues, whether it's regional transportation, regional cultural and resource protection, whatever that is, to continue to do those things. And you look at what Northern Beaufort County has done. What started out as a Northern Beaufort County Steering Committee that was dealing with growth boundaries has continued to operate as an implementation oversight committee. It's not even officially designated, but they still meet on once a month because they are the regional forum where these things have occurred. 10 years later, after that plan was finished, they're still doing it, and there's no reason why you can't do that as well. And I hope that's where this ultimately leads for you. As the mayor said, it is the right time to do it. It is ripe. 10 years from now, it's going to be too late, but you're doing the right thing. So with that, Mayor, would you like to close the meeting? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. Let's thank our speakers.